So, thankfully, this week has started off a bit slower than last week was. Um, with everything that's happened in the last year, with the growing cyberpunk dystopia that we find around us, I decided it's time for me to talk about something that I'm really fond of talking about and don't get a lot of opportunities to, because let's be facing it, talking about government's kind of boring when they're not doing something utterly insane. And although right now they're doing a lot of insane things and therefore there's a lot of interesting stuff, it's all kind of depressing on a day-to-day basis when it's not terrifying. So instead, I want to talk about hope. See, when the US was founded in the 1700s, the hope is that by creating this novel system, we'd be able to avoid the problems that we had in the past. The founding fathers of the US created a republic that was supposed to be able to overcome the issues with monarchy that they saw as being overly oppressive. Obviously, this monarchy at the time was definitely overly oppressive, and I'm sure that if King George of the 1700s were to see the monarchy that now exists in England, he'd probably spend the rest of his life scratching his head and wondering how his however many great generational granddaughter ended up in the position she's in, to where the monarchy has power that they don't use and it's limited, but they're not, no one, I don't think anyone actually knows what powers the monarchy in England still actually have, or in Britain still actually have. That's a whole nother conversation, because I'm actually really fond of talking about the British monarchy too. So, hey. But tonight, because I've said that I'll be doing this, I'm going to start in on an intermittent series about the US system. And the reason I want to do this is multifold. One, I love talking about it. Two, because I think it's really important for us all to remember where we're coming from. And for those of you who are in the United States, you might be 15 years out of school, and the last time you took a civics class was in sophomore year. Or maybe you don't really pay attention to this, and maybe you don't care. And if so, I hope that you stick around and, maybe you learn something. Another is that if you're not from the United States, this should give you some insight as to why the U.S. sometimes looks like it's controlled chaos. Because we have a system that is very different than most, if not all, their systems. And I want to get into that tonight so that you can understand better. See, there was a conversation I was having with an Australian back after some to-do or another occurred. And we were having a debate. And he goes, well, why can't the federal government just do it? And I said, the federal government doesn't have the right. And he's like, what do you mean the federal government doesn't have the right? And I explained the 10th Amendment to him, and he goes, oh. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this too, is because I know there's a lot. I do have a non-American audience, which I love the fact that I've got a non-American audience in addition to the American audience. And my hope is this will give you some insight. So, without further ado, as we continue to navigate the cyberpunk dystopia, let's see if we can use the information tonight to kind of make it go away. This is the Julien McBain Show. As always, the Julien McBain Show is brought to you by my patrons, and it's brought to you by the U.S. Constitution, because we're practicing freedom of speech here, guys, even as there are elements trying to stop it from happening. Okay, so what is the United States really, right? You've probably heard it discussed as it's a country, it's a republic, it's a democracy. So let's dig into like the 10,000-foot look at things. The United States is a federal, presidential, constitutional republic. Federal, meaning we're a federation. We are a union of different states that have a government that umbrellas all of us, even though each state may have their own government structures. And there's a difference between the way the U.S. federal system works and the way most other countries' federal systems work, which I'll get into in a little bit. And to my knowledge, we're the only ones that do it the specific way we do it. There are other federal systems with states like Mexico, Germany, and what have you. But there's a very special piece of U.S. law that makes us work a little bit differently in very unexpected ways. I do need to stipulate as we go into this, I am not a lawyer. I am not licensed to practice law in any of the 50 U.S. states or any nation of the world. That being said, I like to think that I'm fairly well read, and I have done a lot of research on this. So, in fact, I'm pretty sure that my research into the U.S. Constitution is probably second only to the amount of time I've done researching World War II. And I spent 12 years on that, so think about that for a second. Okay. We're a federation, an organization of states unionized under a single constitution with a body legislative, an executive, and a court system, a judicial system that is there to manage the interconnected pieces of we call it a nation. It's more than, we call it a nation. There. The United States are a nation. Presidential. The president serves as both head of state and head of government. A lot of nations, as I'm sure most of you know, have parliaments and the head of state and head of government. The head of government is the prime minister, whereas the head of state would be the monarch or a president, like in Russia, where they're a semi-presidential federation. In the United States, the president is both head of state and head of government in law. In practice, the head in practice, in a lot of ways, the vice president and the speaker of the house carry out the functions that we would normally see in a head of government, or at least from what I gather would be. And it's actually very interesting when I get into, I'm going to do episodes on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all that. The fact that the vice president's the president of the Senate gets into the place where the people who actually framed the Constitution didn't actually want the title of president to be president. That's a whole nother story, but just keep that in your mind as we go down through these things. Constitutional, speaking of which, that's pretty self-explanatory. We have a constitution. I encourage anyone who has an actual interest in this to go read it and think of it very much in a 1700s context, not a modern context, because words change meaning over time. And the thing about law and constitutions is you have to read it in the context of when it was written, or else it doesn't make as much sense. And republic. We are a republic. We are not a democracy. We're founded on democratic institutions. And we use democratic institutions to do things like run our elections. But a democracy has flaws. Republics have flaws too, as do monarchies, as does every system in the world. You won't find a perfect system. But the difference is, in a democracy, which we actually practice at the state level in some states, actually in all states to a certain extent, but some states more than others. I'll get into that too. In a democracy, law is made by a vote of 50% plus one. And so it's basically mob rule. It's mob rule by a legal system rather than by torches and pitchforks. I almost said pitches and torchforks. I don't know why. I can't word tonight. I cannot word tonight. But it's still basically mob rule. In a republic, people elect representatives. Those representatives go to a body Congress or a body legislative, and they pass laws based on what their best estimate of what the people want is. And by having a bicameral legislature, which we do here in the U.S., we have a Senate and a House. That's its whole own animal, and I will do an episode on that alone in the future. Which, by the way, that dual bicameral legislature is replicated in each individual state, and there are reasons for that. In fact, the whole system is replicated in each individual state. The only difference is that states are headed by governors, not by presidents. And so let's actually get into that piece. Unlike other countries, even ones where their constituent bodies are called states, in the U.S., the federal government is not the basis for sovereignty. Okay, now that you're looking at me funny, the federal government is not the basis of sovereignty in the United States. In the United States, the basis of sovereignty are the individual states. They are the individual states. Having said that, here's why. States in the U.S. are sovereign to each other. And that's period dot. Full stop. To the point where, and this is how sovereign we are to each other. If I start a company here in Vermont and register it as a domestic company, right? That makes perfect sense. Domestic corporation. And I decide I want to do business in New Hampshire, which is the state adjacent to me. I have to register my company as a foreign company in New Hampshire. Yes. Citizens in the United States are citizens of the United States and of their individual state. We use the term resident to help differentiate between citizenship and state citizenship. But at its core, if you look at all of the old constitutional documents, especially from the original 13 colonies and the former Republic of Vermont, and I believe Kentucky is written like this too, because they were admitted shortly after Vermont was. They say, residents of the state are citizens of the United States and of this state. So there's that dynamic. States cannot in any way impose law on each other. So like New York can't pass a law that affects Vermont residents when they're in Vermont. They can't pass a law that affects New York residents while they're in Vermont, with a couple of minor, there's some tax law. Because they can't say, if you pay tax to New York, then you can't pay or they can't force you to do something that would violate a law in another state. Like if the state of Vermont says you must eat pickles on Thursday if you're a Vermont resident, but you travel to New York, and in New York it's illegal to eat pickles on Thursday. You cannot be prosecuted under Vermont law even though you're a Vermont resident because you were in New York and could not eat a pickle on Thursday. Yes, I deliberately used something silly, but this becomes really important when it comes to things like firearms law, which I will get into when I do my whole discussion on the Second Amendment, and I'm really, really anxious to do that one. In case you hadn't noticed, that's one of my favorite ones to talk about. Speaking of which, I forgot to wear Greta today. So, states cannot impose law on each other. States actually maintain their own armed forces in addition to the standing forces of the United States. Now, here's where it gets a little funky. Okay? In the United States, you have the National Guard, and you probably have all heard about the president calling up the National Guard. In the United States, National Guard members are actually members of two separate military organizations. You heard that correctly. They are members of the National Guard of their branch of the United States, which is callable by the President of the United States, and they are members of the National Guard of their branch of this state that they signed up in, or that they reside in. So, for instance, if I were to enlist in the National Guard, I am actually dual enlisting in two separate organizations, in the National Guard of the United States and the National Guard of the state of Vermont. Be it Army, Air Force, doesn't matter. In addition, states also have the right, and only 26 states to my knowledge have one, to set up separate defense forces. These defense forces are authorized under, for those of you who care, are authorized under Title 32 of the United States Code. This is the same title that the National Guard is organized under. These forces are not federalizable. And so there are 26 states with separate military forces that are not touchable by the federal government. I think I just heard a bunch of jaws drop. That's okay. In addition to those state defense forces, there's also naval militias. Naval militias are kind of unique because they're a state military force that consists of basically naval reservists. So they're U.S. forces on state level grounding. It's a very archaic type of militia. In some states, they have an unorganized militia. Like the state of Vermont, my state, actually has four distinct military entities, all of which are ultimately responsible to the governor, three of which report directly to the adjutant general, who's the person in charge of the National Guard. So you've got the Army National Guard, the Air National Guard, which are self-explanatory. You've got the Vermont State Guard, which is Vermont's normal state defense force, which is in my state. So I actually hold a commission with the Vermont State Guard. In my state, the purpose of the Vermont State Guard is to maintain a cadre of trained officers and enlisted persons that can do two things. One, assist the National Guard in certain duties. And two, if the unorganized militia is ever called up, the Vermont State Guard is the organization the unorganized militia gets drafted into. So there, in a lot of ways, we're a placeholder organization, but we do have a support role to the National Guard. The fourth military institution in Vermont is the Vermont Military Institute, also known as Norwich University. Most people don't realize that not all of them, the majority of the professors at Norwich are members of the Vermont militia, the organized militia. This is separate from the other three branches. They are responsible to the governor. The head of Norwich is a 2-star general. In addition, the entire cadet corps of Norwich can be, by executive order, drafted to service as Vermont militia. It's happened before. It happened in World War II. The whole cadet corps. It's a regiment. It's 1,000 people. And so Vermont's very unique in that way. Other states don't have it like that. That doesn't mean that other states don't have their unique quirks. Texas especially has its own unique quirks because their state guard is very, very large in comparison to other states. Of course, Texas is a state that you can drive for 12 hours and still be in Texas. But it just goes to show, you wouldn't find this in many other places. I could talk about that all night. I'm sorry. Governors are classified as heads of state. So the president is the head of state of the United States and head of government. And the governors are the heads of state and heads of government of the individual states, of the several states. And they are due all of the honors of a head of state. When the president receives a governor, he receives them as a head of state, not as a subordinate. Governors are not subordinate to the president, nor is the president subordinate to them, of course. The best way I've been able to describe it is the president is technically a first among equals. They're peers. They're peers. Very much in the British sense, except that they're elected and can get voted out of office, even when they don't want to be. On that note, because the governors are peers, so are the states. No matter what other factors are involved, states are equals. And this is why you see there are 2 senators for each state in the Senate. Because the Senate does not represent the people, it represents the state. And I'm going to get deeper into that when I talk about the legislative branch in a future episode. But this is a misconception a lot of people have, especially in my own country, that the Senate represents the people. They were never meant to represent the people that represent the states, which is why every state has 2 senators. because all of the states are equal to each other. And no state should ever be subordinate to another state. Again, they're sovereign to each other. They're equal to each other. This is the basis of the foundation upon this, of the sovereignty that the U.S. is based upon. On that note, each state has its own culture, and some states have multiple. A great example, if you go to Vermont, you're going to find some very interesting things. We're a very quirky state. I've heard New Yorkers call us quaint. Vermont has its own breed of hillbilly, of which I am technically one. Believe it? Yes, I'm a hillbilly. I take off the suit, I get into jeans, I jump on a tractor. I don't even need to take off the suit. I've jumped on a tractor in a full suit. Been there, done that. Each state has its own culture. Some states have multiple cultures. Vermont alone has 2 very diverse cultures. You've got the urban culture up in Burlington. You got the rural culture everywhere else. Or I should say Chittenden County. One county pretty much encompasses the majority of urban culture in Vermont. And then you've got the rest of the state. And it's not that they aren't all Vermonters, but you can see a difference in attitude. And this is reflected across the United States between urban and rural cultures, but each one is very unique. When I was in North Dakota, it's a very much a farm state. And the farmers have a huge sway over things. Vermont's a farm state too, but not like North Dakota. And so things that were practical in Vermont are not practical there, and vice versa. Very different climate, very different culture, very different people. Texas is the same way. I love talking about Texas. I used to go to Texas a couple times, at least once a year, back when I was dating a girl from there. I love Texas. I do. I will say this, though. If you want to find anything deep fried, literally anything deep fried, go to the Texas State Fair. I have never been. It was on my bucket list because I wanted to see the ridiculousness of what they fry at the Texas State Fair. I shit you not, chicken fried butter sticks. I know. I can't even. Why? So, yes, there's huge cultural differences between the various states. Huge cultural differences. And this is why we have the type of government we have to manage those cultural differences. And this is something, they also have a lot of different traditions. So for instance, in Vermont, we have a tradition called sugar on snow. You won't find it hardly anywhere else. You might find it in New Hampshire or Maine. I've never heard of it in those states. I'm originally from New Hampshire. I'm a Vermonter through and through, but I'm originally from New Hampshire. Never heard about sugar on snow in New Hampshire. My mother grew up in New Hampshire. She had never heard of sugar on snow. Sugar on snow is literally pouring hot maple syrup over cold. You want to use food grade shave ice, but back in the 80s, we actually used snow. Pour it on snow and it makes a candy. And you eat that with a fluffy, homemade apple cider donut and a cup of fresh brewed coffee. There's like a whole thing around it, and this is a cultural tradition, very unique to Vermont. In North Dakota, one of their cultural traditions is Nefla soup, which is a dumpling soup, which I have very happily brought back to Vermont with me. It's amazing. So every state has its own traditions and cultures. And this is why United States is actually plural. In all of our founding documents, it's these United States are. Now, nowadays, because of the way English has evolved, you can say the United States are. Too many people, including myself, tend to go the U.S. is, or the United States is. U.S. is kind of works better than U.S. are, but it's the United States are. These United States are. It's a plural. It is absolutely a plural, and that's something that I really hope comes back to the lexicon, even though it kind of sounds like Middle English, because technically it is. On those cultural differences, 4 U.S. states were once republics. Some were very short-lived, like the Republic of California, I think, was a republic for 9 days or something ridiculous like that. But Vermont was a republic for several years. Actually, I think it was damn close to a decade that Vermont was a republic. Meaning completely sovereign. Texas was a republic for quite some time. California was a republic for a short amount of time. And Hawaii was a republic. Hawaii was also a kingdom. And it's because of that, Hawaii still has its own royal family. So yes, there is a royal family of a state in the United States. Currently, the head of the Hawaiian royal family is Her Royal Highness Princess Oana. I have given up trying to pronounce her last name, and Your Highness, I apologize for that. I would want to hear it from you so I don't screw it up. I am not good with Hawaiian, as much as I'd love to learn the language. The royal family still exists. They still use their titles. They're engaged in cultural diplomacy across the world. The crownofhawaii.com, if you're interested in learning about America's royal family, not the United States' royal family, but the royal family that still lives in America, that's from an American state. On that note, technically the formal title of a governor and the president and all secretaries of states is Your Excellency. And you don't see it used in the United States. The president of the United States is called Mr. President or Madam President when we eventually get our first female woman president, which will happen. It will absolutely happen. But if you go to the UN, they're addressed as Your Excellency. His or Her Excellency, the President of the United States. George Washington used His Excellency in all his formal writing. I know at least 2 governors on all of their most formal writings still use it. I think that might be by law. I know New Hampshire does, and there's one other state. And I think it might be by law that in the most formal documents they must be put in there by order of His Excellency, the Governor of New Hampshire. But technically speaking, all heads of state in the United States and all secretaries of state in the United States are addressed as His or Her Excellency. We just don't do it. Because, well, after you took all that time to pick up arms and throw a monarchy out, do you really want to retain the artifacts of that monarchy? Now, some people who are particularly old-fashioned, including myself, still use it. And when I have written to my governor, which I have, because I've run for office, not the governorship, but I've run for public office, I do open the letter with Your Excellency. I'm sure it makes the governor of Vermont scratch his head a little bit. I'm okay with that. In fact, I kind of wish I was a fly in the wall when he opens it up. And all this leads back to why the U.S. operates like this. It's like, well, why in the world would they create a country where the states are the core of sovereignty? And on top of that, what does that mean? Does that mean that the states can reject something the federal government passes? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. See, in the Constitution is a permissive document. It's also restrictive. But basically speaking, and this, I'm going to kind of botch here. I'm going to go through the Constitution at some point, but basically speaking, in the Constitution, it states, this is how the U.S. government works, this is what the U.S. government's allowed to do, and this is what it's not allowed to do. And then in the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to that Constitution, the last right enumerated in that Bill of Rights does not apply to the people, but rather to the states. And I am going to quickly pull that up. And this might be a rough draft of it. Hang on. Oh no, did they? Okay, good. Here it is. Amendment 10. I was reading one of the early drafts where it was actually 12 amendments instead of 10. Then they realized that some of them are repetitious and they edited things. Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This means that if the federal government passes a law, or a statute, or a regulation that is not specifically authorized to it by the U.S. Constitution, the states only follow it by sufferance. in layman's terms, the states can tell the federal government to fuck off if the federal government passes a law that does not fall under the Constitution. And we have. That's why some states have legalized marijuana, and you don't have the Drug Enforcement Administration walking and trying to arrest half the population, because they can't. And in fact, if they tried, state police can then walk in and arrest them. Yes, this is true. I can imagine the looks on some people's faces. This is how it works here. And we've had cases where state police have threatened federal officers with arrest for violation of the 10th Amendment. Or what amounted to violation of the 10th Amendment. They'd use some other statute, but this has happened. We have had pissing matches between police officers at different jurisdictional levels. I won't even get into some of the videos I've seen where two groups are attempting drug busts and haven't told each other. So you've got sheriff's department doing they were doing a prostitution ring, actually, and I don't remember what state it was in, but the county sheriff was trying to bust people for that practiced in solicitation. They tried to find a prostitute. And then the local police, unaware of this, were sending people out to try and arrest prostitutes. So, cop, pretend prostitute meets cop, pretend buyer. They go back to the hotel. City SWAT team is on the outside of the hotel. Sheriff's Department SWAT team is in the bathroom. And then they roll one on each other. It's kind of amazing no one's gotten shot. This is what happens when you don't communicate with each other. But these jurisdictional things happen. I know that was way off key, but these jurisdictional things have happened. And that was an accident. Now imagine if you've got federal and state cops arguing with each other, and this has happened. Now, thankfully, it's never ended up in a shootout. Usually what happens is whoever appears to have more authority prevails, it goes to court, and it's hammered out in federal court. That's how it works. But states have challenged the federal government and said, if you attempt to enforce this law, we'll arrest the officer. And the federal government's backed off until it could be hammered out in court. So if that's the case, what the hell is the federal government for anyway? If they don't have supremacy over the states, they can't order the things, and the states aren't just like sub-governments like counties and cities are to a state, what's the purpose of the federal government? But the federal government actually has very specific purposes. I'm not going to go into all of them here, but I'm going to go into the big ones. War and diplomacy. Only the federal government of the United States can declare war on other nations, and only the federal government can engage in diplomacy with other nations. Beyond some cultural things, like some states have twin cities with like Japan or China or France or whatever. Cultural things are okay, but not actual diplomacy. Interstate trade, so trade between states, is regulated by the federal government. Now, this is a pretty obvious one. The states can negotiate things and stuff like that, but when it comes to what's allowed to, like, this is where federal law comes in. Federal drug laws are important in that you cannot transport drugs over state lines without federal permission. This is also the most abused clause of the Constitution. It's known as the Commerce Clause, because the federal government uses the Commerce Clause to pass laws and try to impose them upon the states. And then if the states refuse, they'll use federal highway dollars to tell the states they have to comply, or else they're not getting their highway dollars. Some states could care less because they pay in more than they get back from the Fed. Other states, that's a problem. They settle disputes between states. Most of the time, this is handled through the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS. Once it was handled by two big armies fighting each other, deciding they were separate governments. And the fourth big one is to mint money. Obviously, if you want to have a unified currency. Now, states are allowed to use gold and silver as a unique money form. but they can't mint coin with it. So they'd just be producing troy ounces, little bars, essentially. Although that would kind of go back to like the Ferengi system. I kind of like that idea. Slips, strips, bars, and bricks. I'm kind of liking this. Let's go back to that. So that's a really basic top-level rundown of the U.S. system with commentary. And like I said, I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about it all night. I really could. I feel that the U.S. system is utterly unique. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it has been replicated wholesale. I don't think it has. And if I am wrong, if you live in a country that operates pretty much on the same basis that I just told you, please drop a comment. I would love to do research on your country. I love researching countries to begin with because I find them interesting. I find each different culture and each different government system utterly interesting. This is why I studied the totalitarian systems of the 20th century so much, because it's like, who could conceive of such oppressive governing systems? Why would the people accept them? And why is it they were successful? On the same token, I love talking about all governing systems. I like the idea of the EU, even though I think that the way it was formed wasn't thought through as completely as it could have been. That's my opinion. I don't live in the EU. Maybe if you live in the EU, it's great. My big caveat to that is because of the unification of the monetary system and each country still having broad control over its own mints. That was one of my big things where I'm like, I'm not sure how well that's going to work. Like in the US, we have a unified mint. Only the federal government can produce money. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. If I've got an EU resident or EU citizen in here, please correct me if I'm wrong. My interpretation of my research, which admittedly is not complete, is that different countries have different mints for euros. They're still printing the same euro. €1 in Greece is worth €1 in Germany, is worth €1 in France, is worth €1 in Liechtenstein. I don't even know if Liechtenstein is part of the EU. But because they can print them, and theoretically they could, I know that there's an agreement on how they do it. Again, I'm not an expert on the European Union. This is a hole in my knowledge that I am going to need to do more research on. If one country decided to go off the rails and just start mass printing money, that would screw the euro royally. And it would take a while for the rest of the EU to figure out what's going on. I find that to be a flaw. That's my opinion. I am not saying the US system is perfect. It is not. If the events of the last year are any indication, we are far from perfect. But it's a good system. And the European Union's a good system, so far as I've seen. It's still very young in comparison to the individual governments that are the European countries. So I'm curious to see how it evolves over time. But I think that in a lot of ways, it reflects a very European variation on how the U.S. system was built. I'm not saying it was based on the U.S. system, but if you look at the way the two interoperate, I see a lot of similarities. And I think that if I had to make a guess, again, this is me just thinking out loud. When the European Union came together and built the foundations of what would become the EU today, it was informed by the things we did in the US. And they said, we want to do this in a more European way, so let's do it this other way. And they took the things they liked and they abandoned and they dumped the things they didn't. And honestly, I think that's a great way to build any structure. Take the things you like out of each type of system, and you dump the stuff you don't like and you build a system on it. And so I want to get into a piece of nuance here that is very interesting, because part of the US rejecting monarchy was rejecting the nobility, which unfortunately didn't work. The biggest lie we tell ourselves in the United States is that we don't have a nobility. We do. We don't have a that's not entirely true. we don't have a legal nobility. I'm not saying that the nobility, like the people I call the nobility, the aristocracy, the technocracy, are doing anything illegal on its face. What I'm saying is that the government doesn't guarantee them a position of nobility or anything like that. They're not granted title by government. And this actually creates a couple of misconceptions about titles of nobility in the United States. There are a lot of people, U.S. citizens, who believe that U.S. citizens aren't allowed to be granted titles of nobility. This is incorrect. The Constitution reads thusly: no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, except of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. So, let's break that down a little bit. First off, office of profit or trust means office of profit or trust of the United States, not the states generally, the United States government. When they say of the United States, they literally mean of the governing body of the United States, not the contiguous property of. So, like, let's say I'm engaged in a lot of Peace Corps type stuff, right? I go to other countries. I'm in another nation. I help contribute to rebuilding. It's a monarchy. And for my services to the nation, the monarchy makes me a knight. Okay, of the order of, I don't know, the Golden Fleece. Okay, and I come back to the U.S. and I'm back here for the length of time I would need to be eligible to become president, because you do lose eligibility when you move out of the country for a certain length of time to immediately be elected into presidential office. You have to live in the U.S. for a certain length of time. I go through that time, and then I decide I want to run for president. In order for me to be elected, because I hold a title, knighthood's a little weird, because knights are technically commoners, but in the U.S. we see it as a title of nobility. So from the U.S. perspective, knights are nobles, even though they're not. And so I would have to go to Congress. I don't know if I'd have to do it just to run, or if I would have to do it if I was elected. I could not take office until Congress approved me taking office because I had received a title from an outside nation, or I would have to surrender that title prior to taking office. Now, heads of state are given honorary titles all the time. That's standard diplomacy, especially for monarchies. Look down the list of presidents of the United States. You look at titles and honors, and all of them are knights of the British Empire. In what is probably one of the most ironic situations possible. But what it means is the U.S. can't grant titles of nobility. They can't create a baron. Similarly, the individual states cannot do it either. That doesn't mean that citizens of the U.S. cannot be granted noble title from outside monarchs, including our internal monarchy, which is the Hawaiian royal family. That being said, the Hawaiian royal family only maintains their one order of knighthood, which is, I think it's the Order of the Crown. And to my knowledge, it's pretty much relegated to family members or people who do great service to Hawaii. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, it's probably considered honorary, at least from a legal perspective. I don't know how that works, because that's the fact that the U.S. has a royal family in it, an internal royal family, even though it's not the royal family of the United States, the royal family of a state that doesn't have power but still has title. That, oh God. See, it confuses us too. In my opinion, the U.S. system is brilliant, because what it does is it forces power to remain as dispersed as possible. That was the point. And in fact, for a number of years after the United States won its independence from Britain, the individual states were absolutely sovereign under the Articles of Confederation. And the federal government had almost no power at all. And because of problems that were arising, they had to create this constitution to give the federal government some power. Now, the federal government of the United States is far larger and far more powerful than it was ever meant to be. And you can argue whether or not that's right or wrong, good or bad. I personally think that we need to reduce the power of the federal government and get it back into the hands of the states. Does that mean that we reduce the power of the military? No. But the federal government should not be able to state that if you don't follow this federal mandate, we're going to withhold highway funds. Then again, maybe the federal government shouldn't be giving out highway funds. I mean, these are all arguments that we have on basically every 2 to 6 years based on the election cycles for each type of office on what the role of federal government, what the limits on federal government are supposed to be. Ultimately speaking, the arbiter of that is the Supreme Court of the United States. And if you want to learn more about the Supreme Court of the United States, I strongly recommend you go look up CGP Gray's SCOTUS Shenanigans episode, which is as informative as it is hilarious, especially the way he deadpans pretty much the whole thing. It'll give you a really good insight to some of the inner workings of U.S. government and how there are conflicting interests between the seats of power that have to be carefully managed, and that they're not usually as boisterous as what you've been seeing on the news. So I hope that you've all enjoyed this expose into the basics behind the U.S. governing system. There are many things I'm going to go through. I am going to specifically be doing episodes on different articles of the Constitution, and even more specifically on the first 10 amendments of the United States, how the different branches interact with each other, and how the administrative state, the ballooning executive branch, has gone well beyond what was ever expected of it. I mean, hell, the first cabinet only had 3 members. And to be sure, it's because we didn't have need of more. And today, the world is far more complex than it was back in 1790. That being said, it is kind of an interesting artifact of the times that we look at things and we've just seen things grow and grow and grow. And no one ever seems to come back to it was never meant to be like this. Is there any way we can kind of reel things back? And this is something I campaigned on, is that I believe that the states need to take back some of their power that we've abdicated to the federal government. And that's what it is. The reason that the federal government's so large and why it appears to be so powerful is because the states have simply abdicated their rights. And so the Fed says, I want to do this, and the states are like, okay. And a lot of people in the several states are looking to increase the power of the federal government and make this, and I wouldn't say they literally want to make the state subordinate to the Fed. I'm sure there are some who do, but I think they believe that centralization of power is more efficient, which is technically true, kind of. It's true on paper, not always in practice. It's true on paper, but it also means that we have a more unified culture. And the issue with that is when you have a nation as big as ours, as varied as ours, as culturally diverse as ours, where even inside of states, you'll have multiple cultures, let alone between states. A Vermonter in New Hampshire and a New Hampshireite in Vermont, they're 2 very different types of people. I know this because half my family's in Vermont and half my family's in New Hampshire. Boy, ain't there a difference. And so I'll leave it with this. I think that the U.S. system, for at least the U.S., is the best guide to use out of the cyberpunk dystopia we find ourselves in. And for those of you who live in various republics or in democratized monarchies like Britain, the UK, I should say, sorry, the United Kingdom, or oh, come on, Julian. You can think of more than one constitutional monarchy. Any of the Commonwealth states, that's for damn sure. Or Liechtenstein, which actually I looked at the government of Liechtenstein, and the only difference between what they do and what we do here is they're like an individual state of the United States. and they're headed by a hereditary prince as opposed to an elected one. That works. Norway. Norway and Sweden, democratized monarchies. I'm sorry, I'm brain dead tonight. Okay, it's 22 hours on a Monday night when I'm recording this, and this is why my brain no longer functions. So, okay, I'm gonna stop rambling, and I'm gonna end it here. Because yeah, I'll just ramble forever, and I'm sure you don't want to listen to it. I don't know what the next episode will be. I want to limit my US system episodes to 1 a week because I don't want to bore away you guys. And something newsworthy could pop up, and I don't want to go, 3 informative episodes and suddenly there's news. And while I don't do breaking news reporting, and I have proven why that's a bad idea for me to do, I do want to make sure I am keeping up with what's going on as things develop, because this is how we navigate our way out of the cyberpunk dystopia. Keep being a torch in the darkness, my friends. This is the Julien McBain Show. Julien McBain Show is a McBain Manor production. I am your host, Julien McBain. My moderators when I'm live are Kat, Jay Lambertson, and Captain Aubrey. With a huge thank you to my patrons without whose support this would be much more difficult. Red Kryptonite, Jay Lambertson, and Spectrum 3600. If you want to be added to the list of my patrons, please go to patreon.com/JulienMcBain and become a member. I am working on trying to build up some exclusive content. I do have 2 ebooks on there, which are yours if you become a member. And I will be looking at doing some exclusive videos in the very near future, because if you're going to be paying me to do this, I owe you something a little more. So as always, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you in the next one.